Welcome to the debate. Today we are wading into the hyper-aesthetic, highly charged environment of Liz Hadbucks Queendom, which is, well, it's a massive cultural phenomenon, and it perfectly mirrors the contemporary commodification of identity and, the dizzying rise of parasocial worship we see in influencer culture.
It really is a profound and, frankly, pretty disturbing case study. Liz Hadbucks, with her, let's say, curated chaos, her focus on aesthetic excess, in this dedicated performance of absolute feminine control, she's forced us to ask some serious questions about what power even looks like in a digital age, and maybe what price the audience pays for it.
Absolutely. And the core intellectual disagreement we face today is precisely this. Does Liz Hadbucks Queendom fundamentally reconstruct her, or does it merely reinforce toxic femininity? So we're debating the motion, Liz Hadbucks' performance of hyperfemininity is a revolutionary critique of gender norms, not a reinforcement of them.
Okay, and I'll be arguing against that motion. I contend that the overwhelming and visible impact of her brand is the reinforcement and, frankly, glorification of harmful toxic tropes, and that the alleged critical intent, it's simply lost on the scale of her operation.
Right, and I'll be arguing that Liz Hadbucks is, in fact, a self-aware artist using exaggeration and satire, a deliberate, almost gender-as-drag performance to expose the absurdity of the restrictive expectations placed upon, femme identity. She's liberating femininity, I think, by pushing its superficial scripts past their breaking point, inviting us to look beneath the surface.
I see why you might think that, focusing on the intention behind the performance, but let me give you a different perspective. My core claim is that Liz Hadbucks reinforces toxic femininity by glorifying things like vanity, excessive consumption, manipulation. To me, this is merely a sophisticated rebranding of deeply harmful tropes as empowerment. And honestly, the glitter wrapping doesn't change the toxic substance underneath it all.
But doesn't that perspective overlook the strategic nature of the performance itself? Liz reclaims hyperfemininity as an empowered, self-aware stance, not a submissive one. Her tools, the lipstick, stilettos, flirtation, and fashion, they're intentionally over the top, right? Revealing the underlying restrictive script of traditional gender norms by embodying them in a way that's, well, it's too perfect, too intense, maybe, to be entirely real. As the source material notes, performance is not deception, it's transformation. She is being strategic here, not just passively conforming.
Strategic. Okay, but strategic in service of what exactly? My first big concern is that her entire output is essentially toxic traits in glitter wrapping. I mean, she encourages emotional manipulation, an obsessive focus on surface-level beauty, physical dominance. These are textbook elements of toxic femininity, really, built on a zero-sum game of consumption and self-centered dominance. Sociological studies of gendered behavior point this out. And furthermore, her identity seems completely dependent on attention and being desired. Is that really liberation, or is it just exchanging one prison for, I don't know, a prettier cage?
See, I would frame it differently. I don't think she's desperately seeking validation. I think she's manufacturing obsession. She doesn't reinforce the male gaze, she controls it. And crucially, she monetizes it. She turns external attention into internal currency and absolute agency. She's the one holding the reins,
That economic argument is strong, I grant you, but I'm still really concerned about the behavior she models.
Okay, then let's go deeper than just the economic transaction. The ultimate thesis here, I think, is psychological integration. Liz is a symbolic tool for radical self-integration, aligning with the concept of Jungian shadow work. This is the idea of intentionally confronting and integrating the parts of our personality, like the desire for control, maybe chaos, manipulation, that society often forces us to repress. By bringing these aspects into the light, she teaches the audience to name their inner predator so they stop being prey. It's about self-command, really.
That's a compelling theoretical argument about intent. I admit. But have you considered the real-world scale and impact? The line between revolutionary critique and simple reinforcement it's dangerously thin, especially in the context of viral content. Satire misread is still harmful behavior reinforced, isn't it? We have data, showing that something like 68% of TikTok users under 21 don't always recognize satire when it's embedded in highly stylized aspirational content. So if the critique requires the viewer to possess advanced media literacy and, well, psychological training, how can we really argue it's a revolutionary movement for the masses?
I appreciate the concern regarding that statistic, yeah, and it does highlight a serious gap in media education today, for sure. But I would argue that this misunderstanding is actually an essential part of the critique itself. It's kind of a meta-modern approach. Liz operates in a space where irony is so seductive, it almost collapses into sincerity, challenging the audience's own deeply rooted desire for, authenticity in influencer culture.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. I mean, how can the performance be effective satire if the majority of the audience misses the irony and simply copies the blueprint for manipulation?
But that's precisely the point she might be making. If the audience flunked media literacy, as you put it, well, that exposes how fandom, capitalism, and beauty culture already coalesce into these quasi-religious rituals. What she calls Lizianity, right? This quasi-religious fandom built around her aesthetic rules and dominance rituals. She is holding a mirror up to the existing cult of personality that already demands this type of rigid, high-performance femininity.
Okay, but that mirror is unfortunately highly filtered and extremely exclusionary. Her power is just inextricably tied to a hyper-aesthetic standard. The pink hair, the heels, the perfected body, the unshakable confidence. If the critique is meant to dismantle restrictive gender norms, why is the vehicle for this critique one that demands such rigid, expensive, and frankly aesthetic perfection? This just becomes aspirational reinforcement. And we see the real-world consequences, right? There's been a massive rise in young people turning to cosmetic surgery. Botox use alone is up 54% among young women since 2020. This kind of exclusionary aestheticism narrows femininity down to glamour, luxury, and sex appeal, which, that's the definition of reinforcing the structure, not tearing it down.
I appreciate the data point on the rise in cosmetic procedures. That impact is undeniably negative. I won't argue that. But does the existence of a negative outcome completely nullify the critical intent? The fact that she is highly stylized is precisely the point, isn't it? It demonstrates that gender is constructed. It is gender as drag. She's not claiming to be a universal template. She's an aspiration wrapped in contradiction. She represents the right to choose performance. Maybe, not necessarily escape it. She's maximizing her agency within the system to highlight its artifice.
Okay, let's pivot then to the nature of power. Is this genuine liberation if the power remains rooted solely in attention, worship, being desired? You mentioned resource acquisition. Okay, but when that acquisition relies fundamentally on seduction and flirtation, it really suggests her entire identity structure is still dependent on external, often male validation, even if she claims to control it. The source material itself kind of suggests this is just reinforcing a gender binary that favors dominance and attention-seeking. This romanticization of behaviors like, gaslighting and seduction for control, it's dangerously close to glamorizing emotional abuse as a form of agency.
But I would approach that idea differently. We're talking about traditionally shamed traits, flirtation, dominance, ambition, that Liz reframes as strategic power tools. Seduction becomes a strategic skill, maybe not a weakness. You call it attention-seeking, I might call it resource acquisition. Liz is the mint. Attention is just the currency she prints, right? Creators who exaggerate femininity in self-aware ways, like, those in trends such as Barbie-core or Bimbo-core, they explicitly frame themselves as in control of desire. They are leveraging the cultural script, not submitting to it. Liz is simply maximizing her agency within the existing capitalist and attention-based system.
But this whole conversation we're having about agency, resource acquisition, emotional fluency is incredibly nuanced, isn't it? The mass audience, though, they hear a simplified doctrine. Manipulation is just emotional fluency with eyeliner. You really cannot divorce the performance from the outcome. If the outcome is that young people start justifying emotional dominance and, frankly, cruelty as some kind of survival strategy necessary for success, then the critique has failed on a social level, and the reinforcement of toxicity has fundamentally won.
Well, I think we need to revisit the psychological foundation here, because this is where the motion truly holds up and addresses the why behind the behaviors. Liz is the embodiment of the parts of the self, the narcissism, the chaos, the need for control, that society demands we repress, or at least hide.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the mass audience is engaging in deep Jungian shadow integration when they watch a 1-minute video about optimizing their emotional control. That just sounds incredibly esoteric for content consumed at such a massive scale.
But they don't necessarily have to consciously understand the theory for the effect to be felt, do they? When we repress those aspects of the ego, they fester and manifest unconsciously in harmful ways. By performing these parts, being the showgirl who dances with the shadow, as the source puts it, she invites the viewer toward internal wholeness, making the unconscious conscious. For example, the source material argues, vanity is not believing you're better than others, it's believing you deserve to be seen. That shifts the frame, doesn't it? From malicious narcissism to self-command. She teaches you to identify the part of yourself that craves control so you can choose what to do with that craving, rather than letting it secretly dictate your behavior.
That may be the theoretical payoff, yes, but the practical behavioral reinforcement is the message eat or be eaten and climb or be tossed. And this reinforces a competitive and, ruthless view of femininity, which inherently alienates anyone seeking liberation through, say, collective care or restraint. Her queendom reinforces a capitalist, hierarchical structure where power is gained through being irresistible and winning the attention economy, not through genuine structural critique or solidarity.
I disagree that it's too esoteric. It's simply radical honesty about the self, perhaps. She's not asking you to deny the dark parts of your ego. She's asking you to see them so they stop driving you in secret. She isn't teaching narcissism. She's teaching the self-awareness of narcissistic tendencies. You master the venom maybe by learning how you use it, not by pretending you don't have fangs. That, I think, is true psychological freedom.
Look, I understand the ambition behind the psychological reframing. I really do. But the visible impact is what matters to culture. When Lizianity functions primarily as a set of aspirational behaviors tied to longing, competitive indulgence, and this intense aesthetic hunger, it reinforces the very systems it claims to poison. The goal should be to free identity from the burdens of aesthetic performance and dominance, not to make those burdens shinier, more seductive, and infinitely more demanding.
So, I stand by the argument that Liz Hadbucks is a kind of mirror ball reflecting every egoic impulse the audience tries to silence. She's not a fantasy to obey necessarily, but a symbolic tool to understand the parts of the self that crave control, providing an invitation to integration and self-rule. Her critique works precisely because it is so incredibly seductive and difficult to just ignore.
And I maintain that the magnetic lure of glamorized toxic traits ensures that audiences mimic more than they understand. While the intent may be high-level deconstruction, the visible impact restricts femininity to an aspirational, dominant, and incredibly high aesthetic performance. Liz Hadbucks has maybe unintentionally created a perfect example of what post-feminist media culture looks like when toxic traits are repackaged as the ultimate form of agency. And that leaves us, with a prettier cage perhaps, but a cage nonetheless.
The debate hinges then, it seems, on whether conscious performance successfully translates into genuine social critique and liberation, or if the power of glamorized consumption and dominance is simply too strong to be undone by irony when it's delivered at such a mass scale.
Indeed, the fundamental tension remains right there between the claimed liberating potential of intentional satire and the behavioral reinforcement that occurs when that satire is consumed and, acted upon as sincere gospel. It certainly leaves us with much more to explore in the material.